Welcome to the West End of Cincinnati. The West End was a thriving black neighborhood in Cincinnati. The West End had a strong sense of community, with neighbors often helping each other take care of their kids and their kids playing together. It was a neighborhood full of life and energy. On screen you can see a church in the West End that connected the community. The West End was a self-sufficient neighborhood with numerous locally owned businesses. It had stores on each side of the block. Some of these local businesses included Bilardo's Delicatessen on Bay Miller Street, or the poultry store on West Court Street, or bars on Central Avenue, or the other numerous businesses on Central Avenue.
Welcome to Indianapolis, the capital of Indiana. On the map, one can see two streets exiting diagonally from the city center. To the northeast is Massachusetts Avenue, and to the northwest is Indiana Avenue. Indiana Avenue was once the center of black culture and life in Indianapolis. From the 1930s to the 1970s, it went by many names: the Yellow Brick Road, Funky Broadway, the Grand Ole Street, and most simply, the Avenue. It was the center of music, social life, economic endeavors, and housing for most of the African American population in the city. Indiana Avenue was recognized for its clubs, theaters, and cafes that line the main street. However, the Avenue was most recognized for its vibrant jazz and music scene. At its height, jazz music would spill out of more than 30 clubs along the Avenue, and the neighborhood would host famous musicians from all over the United States. Overall, this was a community that supported black business and entrepreneurs, emphasized and centered black community, and served as a cultural hub for its residents.
The West End and Indiana Avenue were just two examples of thriving African American communities that existed all over the Midwest. Centers of African American culture, business, and community existed in Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and more. However, these Midwestern African American communities would soon face a new obstacle, one that would attempt to erase the culture and structures that existed in favor of creating a new order. This obstacle was known as urban renewal.
This documentary will illustrate the ramifications of urban renewal on Midwestern African American neighborhoods by using the West End and Indiana Avenue as case studies. Although different mechanisms were used to instigate urban renewal in these two communities, the overall effects were the same, illustrating the damage that urban renewal had on African American communities throughout the Midwest.
Urban renewal is the government-planned and funded redevelopment of areas within a large city, typically involving the clearance of slums and blighted areas. The urban renewal movement took place between the late 1940s and early 1970s and was a very specific element of urban redevelopment history within the United States. In the mid-1900s, cities all over the United States began to deteriorate and face disinvestment. As wealthier middle-class residents fled to the suburbs, impoverished and often minority residents were left in the urban core. Urban homes and businesses soon fell into disrepair, and cities were either unable or unwilling to assist in improvement efforts. In response to these declining conditions, city officials began looking for ways to revitalize their cities and attract new residents and visitors. The federal government also became invested in clearing slums and blighted areas, creating better housing and making transportation more efficient. Thus, urban renewal was crafted as a solution. Cities would propose urban renewal projects, then backed up by federal funding and eminent domain would acquire private homes that were usually deemed substandard, raise those houses, and redevelop the land for new uses.
Urban renewal was initiated by the Housing Act of 1949, signed by President Truman. At its passage, President Truman declared that it equips the federal government for the first time with effective means for aiding cities in the vital task of clearing slums and rebuilding blighted area, and that it was his prerogative to implement these programs as quickly and efficiently as possible. This act provided federal funding that could be used for slum clearance and public housing projects. The act was updated several times, but instances of note are the Housing Act of 1954 and the Housing Act of 1959. The Housing Act of 1954 increased the federal funding provided to cities for slum clearance projects and made the funding more flexible. Now, funding for property acquisition, demolition of structures, and site preparation was expanded to include projects for commercial and industrial development and not just public housing. The Housing Act of 1959 made the federal funding even more flexible and funded additional development opportunities. A key change was that states and cities could acquire more funding if their slum clearance project was executed in part for a university development. Proponents of this addition stressed that this change would be a measured step towards the solution of two problems that were of immediate congressional concern: the elimination of urban slums and the expansion of American educational facilities. Overall, these acts paved the way for urban renewal projects throughout the Midwest, including the projects that occurred in the West End and Indiana Avenue. While Indiana Avenue was always a thriving African American neighborhood, it did begin to face poverty and deterioration. By the 1950s, the community was significantly more overpopulated and impoverished than it had been even 20 years earlier. Businesses were closing, social services were leaving, and residents who could afford to move also left. After those mass closures and departures, all that was left on the avenue was vice, gambling, a few one-night stands by local musicians, and mostly poor residents living in increasingly dilapidated housing. The city of Indianapolis needed an alternative to all of the blight on and around Indiana Avenue, and Indiana University's Medical Center became the city's target investment. Both city administrators and university faculty looked down on Indiana Avenue with disdain. One faculty member, Thurman Rice, even declared that Indiana Avenue is an extremely ugly slum that needs to be eradicated. In the 1950s, Indiana University proposed an expansion which would involve constructing an adjoining undergraduate medical campus, dental school, and campus housing alongside the existing hospital. A project at this scale required significant acreage, and the only remaining space was in the densely settled, predominantly African American neighborhood known as Indiana Avenue. In their mutual disdain for Indiana Avenue, Indiana University partnered with the Indianapolis Redevelopment Commission and joined the urban renewal movement that was sweeping the nation. In 1958, the Indianapolis Redevelopment Commission and Metropolitan Planning Department jointly published their first master design for Indiana Avenue in the greater West Side area. A significant portion of this plan, entitled the Central Business District Report, was dedicated to Indiana University's Medical Center expansion. The expansion would in part be on lands already cleared by urban renewal projects that began in 1954 and 1956 respectively, Project D and Project F. First, the Indianapolis Redevelopment Commission would declare that the areas along Indiana Avenue were blighted. Then, the city would purchase and clear these individual parcels and sell them back to the university. The clearing process happened through Project D and F. Project D, beginning in 1954, raised a 19-acre neighborhood immediately adjoining the University Medical Center. Project F, beginning in 1956, was where the city and commission jointly purchased 104 homes for $503,000 and relocated 372 residents. Through the 1950s, Indiana University and the city of Indianapolis were partners in urban renewal and campus expansion. However, by the 1960s, Indianapolis's Chamber of Commerce began to reject the idea of federally funded projects. Thus, after 1962, the Chamber rejected federal urban renewal funds and stopped conducting projects. This forced the university to take on a more direct role in their expansion initiatives as the university began to go out and acquire the properties themselves. By the late 1960s, Indiana University was acquiring about 10 to 20 properties each month from the Indiana Avenue neighborhoods. The ultimate goal was to acquire around 1,000 individual parcels. With each property purchased and raised, the community began to disappear, and parking lots began to spring up in its place.
The city of Cincinnati was looking for a way to get more people in the city, with the suburbs drawing everyone out. Their solution was the 1948 Master Plan. On November 22, 1948, the 1948 Master Plan was adopted by the Cincinnati City Council. This plan called for the construction of Mill Creek Expressway, or now known as I-75. This plan also called for 13 superblocks of manufacturing and light industry. All of these would be placed in the West End of Cincinnati. In the 1950s, city planners declared deteriorating buildings in the West End as blighted. This blight title gave the city federal funds via the Housing Act of 1954 and the ability to begin the project. What they didn't take into account was the community that was there. In 1958, preliminary plans were approved. This began the process of urban renewal in the West End, which would eventually cut the neighborhood in half and demolish 2,600 buildings. In 1959, a photo record of every building being cleared was created, which would later be used for a project to remember the lost West End. These photos are held in the Cincinnati Museum Center's archives. For the families that lived here, these photos are the only thing left of the neighborhood where they grew up. In 1960, families were told the harsh reality that they had to leave. The families had to abandon the neighborhood they love. People living in the West End at the time were hostile, and as Dr. Owens, president of Interact for Health and a former resident of the West End, recalls, they called urban renewal Negro removal. By 1962, most of the land was cleared, and in 1965, the Mill Creek Expressway, or now I-75, was constructed, displacing 25,737 people, the majority of which were African Americans. From the map on the screen, you can see how the area changed from this urban renewal. The dotted black line is I-75 going through the neighborhood.
These projects had differences in terms of funding and the initiatives that made them possible, but ultimately, these projects both completely changed the demographics, landscapes, and community of thriving African American neighborhoods.
Funding was a huge difference in the two projects. Kenyon-Barr was completely federally funded by the Housing Act of 1954. Since this act allowed cities to federally fund projects for industrial development, it was perfect for the Kenyon-Barr project. The federal government and the city of Cincinnati partnered to complete the project. At the project's start, the university and city of Indianapolis also worked as partners in urban renewal. Initially, Indiana Avenue was federally funded by the Housing Act of 1959. This act provided additional funds to the city of Indianapolis for initiating a project that expanded university development. However, in the 1960s, the city of Indianapolis decided to reject all forms of federal funding. Thus, IUPUI was forced to take over the project by themselves and use university funds to finance the remainder of the project. Another major difference between the two projects was their respective timelines. It took the university over 20 years to acquire all of the properties for their project along Indiana Avenue. Thus, this was a slower process of urban renewal than most, including the project in Kenyon-Barr, which took 6 years to remove and construct. These different timelines created a difference in how soon community members felt the effects of urban renewal. With the shorter timeline, West End residents were quickly displaced. However, due to the university's slow expansion, it took many years before residents could see the ramifications of urban renewal.
The first major similarity between the Kenyon-Barr and Indiana Avenue projects was their change in demographics. In both cases, one can see a stark contrast in the African American population over time. In the case of the West End, it was once a lively center of economic activity for African Americans. In 1960, before the urban renewal project was completed, almost the whole area was populated by African Americans. However, by 1980, almost all African American presence was removed from the western region of the West End. Where hundreds of dots once clustered, now only a few remained. Indiana Avenue faced a similar demographic transition. In the 1950s, it was a very vibrant and diverse neighborhood. Everywhere along Indiana Avenue, at least 60% of the population was African American. In some areas, the population was even 95%. Unfortunately, by 1990, the time it took for IUPUI to complete their urban redevelopment projects, a large portion of the African American population had been removed. In the same areas where there had once been 95% African Americans, there were now less than 30%. Overall, both the West End and Indiana Avenue saw a huge displacement of African American residents due to urban renewal. The next similarity between the Kenyon-Barr and Indiana Avenue projects was the radically different landscape left behind after urban renewal. In the case of Kenyon-Barr, the project replaced businesses and housing with a giant highway, I-75. The creation of the highway raised the community and cut off the remaining West End community from the rest of the city. In the case of Indiana Avenue, homes and businesses were replaced by parking lots, campus green space, and some campus buildings. Not only did the university replace these community fixtures, but they also went so far as to eliminate historical landmarks, change street names, and reroute the streetscape to completely erase the old avenue from existence. For example, Bright Road was changed to University Boulevard, and entire blocks of residential units were replaced by parking lots and garage structures. In both cases, urban renewal changed the landscape in order to accommodate automobiles at the price of communities. Finally, the last similarity between the Kenyon-Barr and Indiana Avenue projects was that vibrant communities were lost. In the rush to build new structures and eliminate blight, government, industry, and universities raised the structures that built a community and dispersed all of these members throughout the city. Residents who fought against change were quickly swallowed by the urban renewal projects themselves, losing everything that makes a house a home and a neighborhood a community. Jazz music stopped flowing down the avenue, and Black businesses fell throughout the West End. These are the things that were lost to urban renewal.
By looking at these two specific cases, we can see the effect that urban renewal projects throughout the Midwest had on their respective African American communities. Despite differences in funding, federal regulations, or timelines, in the end, urban renewal had similar ramifications for once thriving African American neighborhoods. Families were displaced, and communities were lost.
In cities all over the Midwest, families and communities of color were displaced. The project Renewing Inequality visualizes these displacements, a direct effect of urban renewal. Every circle represents a city where families were displaced by urban renewal, and the bigger the circle, the more people who are displaced. Purple circles represent people of color, and green circles represent white people. Between 1950 and 1966, the United States displaced over 300,000 families, and over 600 cities initiated urban renewal projects. A significant number of these projects occurred in the Midwest, in cities such as Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit, and St. Louis. And many of the projects in the Midwest targeted minority communities, much more than white communities. Throughout the Midwest, hundreds of communities were lost. The West End and Indiana Avenue are just two examples of thriving Black neighborhoods that were raised during the urban renewal movement. Thus, the implementation of urban renewal projects in Cincinnati and Indianapolis reveal the social and cultural significance of urban renewal nationally. Because despite differences in enabling regulations or funding sources, urban renewal in both cases completely changed the demographics, landscapes, and community of thriving African American neighborhoods. As demonstrated by Renewing Inequality, this trend is not specific to the West End and Indiana Avenue. Urban renewal created lost communities throughout the Midwest.